was a no-brainer that he be honored in some fashion with a certificate and a short speech. It felt to me to deliver that speech, and so in doing so, I learned that all about what Mort had accomplished as a journalist, particularly his 40-year career with Women's Wear Daily, of which the modest Mort had said little. I learned that he, as much as anyone, had transformed it from a trade paper that strictly covered 7th Avenue business into a vehicle that covered the intersection of fashion with pop culture, politics, sports, and the social movements of the day. A trend that, by the way, has been echoed by major newspapers across the country. Mort was its managing editor for 30 years. He not only turned out memorable interviews with such celebrities as Sid Caesar, John Lindsay, Tom Wolfe, and Margaret Mead, but he produced lively travel pieces to exotic spots like Nepal, and he also mentored a generation of young journalists. For all that, the board unanimously decided that he deserved this year's Lifetime Achievement Award. This is why we're honoring Mort today. The Silurians Press Club Lifetime Achievement Award to Mort Sheinman for his stellar editorial leadership during a 40-year career at Women's Wear Daily, transforming the trade newspaper into a more colorful, comprehensive, and trustworthy record of the world of fashion and beauty, while mentoring countless young reporters as a one-man journalism school, all with wit and grace. Here, Mort. Thank you very much. This is somehow coming off.
I want to say thank you to everybody who's here, to everybody who's worked with me over the years, both here and at Women's Wear. I'm going to keep it short right now because there's more to come, but I just want to acknowledge this. I also want to point out that the transformation of Women's Wear Daily in the last half century or so, I was part of that, a small part of that. I can go into that later, but I was there when it happened, and to a certain extent, smaller than you might think, I helped make it happen. But it was John Fairchild's vision and his genius that really inspired us all, and I just want to get that on the record. As far as today is concerned, it's an unexpected honor. I'm very proud of what went on in the Silurians in the 20 or so years since I've been a member of this club. And I want to, again, thank everybody here for showing up today. You do me proud. I'm overwhelmed. I'm a little nervous. And I can't thank you enough. So thank you.
Mort, the paparazzi will be outside later waiting for you, okay? The paparazzi will be outside waiting for you in a little while, okay? Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Joe. To say it's an honor to testify on behalf of my friend and colleague, Mort Sheinman, is an understatement. We both worked for many years for Fairchild's Women's Wear Daily, as you've heard, then a singularly quirky newspaper, eccentric, powerful beyond its size, serious, and sometimes not so serious. Buttoned up journalistically when it came to a global, influential, high-powered business, obsessive about accuracy and breaking stories. And we were also a little unbuttoned when it came to the often outrageously creative characters who populated the fashion world or circled its vast periphery. In fact, a few weeks ago when Henry Kissinger passed away, I remembered how our fearless and kooky genius leader, John Fairchild, wanted Dr. Kissinger to be referred to in print as Herr Dr. K, that German genius. Well, Kissinger apparently hated this and complained to Mr. Fairchild, but he also told Mr. Fairchild that The only time his mother commented about his press was when he was mentioned in Women's Wear Daily, which was often. So sorry, New York Times and Washington Post and Newsweek and Time. Mrs. Kissinger was most impressed with us. In any case, the paper came up with an even better nickname for Kissinger, and he was ultimately anointed the Playboy of the Western Wing. Now, I could stay up here and rain purple prose about Mr. Sheinman, but we'll get into that in a minute. But I thought his own words could make a better case for some of his contributions to our craft. Here's one of Mort's leads. He came striding down the avenue with all the swagger of some high roller off a Mississippi riverboat, a flash of blue pinstripes on a sharp white suit, a shiny white tie with dark blue polka dots, a light blue shirt and gold collar pin, laced up white shoes and a tall black hat with enough brim to keep the upper half of his body from being assaulted by the sun. He was a snowflake in the dog days of summer, a lily white superfly. It was vintage Tom Wolfe, and if the look is starting to wear a bit thin, Wolfe is the first to admit it. That's from Mort's fabulous 1979 profile of Tom Wolfe, around the time The Right Stuff came out. Wolfe went on to lament that his look was being eclipsed by Saturday Night Fever. Mort, of course, went beyond style and got Wolfe talking about the nature of courage, adventure, new journalism, celebrity, and the writing process. Wolfe tells Mort, "Writing to me is like arthritis. It hurts every day." Mort's biggest legacy at the paper was his long tenure as managing editor at Women's Wear and W. Now, we all know that the ME is the fulcrum of every newsroom. For us, Mort was the man, the gatekeeper, the deadline cop, the standard bearer, pushing a crazy, chaotic, energetic newsroom to aspire to the highest journalistic ideals on the fly. He trained generations of reporters and editors, many of whom went on to populate the most influential newspapers, magazines, and broadcast media around the world. And what did those generations learn? Well, when you hired a reporter or editor from Fairchild, and we were rated pretty regularly by all of you, and truth be told, we were a little on the cheap side. But you got someone who could read a balance sheet, go deep on a fashion or cultural trend, write a poignant obit, write captions, stage a shoot, copy edit a story, or write a headline to fit. Whether it was a story on mobsters or mergers or wildly creative designers, Mort would often stump a reporter with the simple question, "How do you know this is true?" If you couldn't answer, you crawled back to your desk to start over. Now, Mort might be a pussycat these days, but in that newsroom, he was no pussycat. But then would he ever expect a newsroom ME to be a pushover? I don't think so. In fact, in Women's Wear's case, the term mortification could be used as a verb and an adjective. The verb part was the good part, the planning and the rigorous editing, and when your story went through Mort's process, it was airtight. And sometimes it even sang a little by the time he was done. The adjective part of mortification was mortifying. Your story didn't measure up, and you knew it. Mort's enemies: sloppy reporting, lazy thinking, blown deadlines, shortcuts, disrespect or obliviousness of a rich reporting tradition, dull headlines, cliches. I once foolishly suggested to Mort that cliches aren't always bad. They might clarify or satirize a point, I argued, especially for the non-discriminating reader. I immediately knew I'd dropped a few pegs in Mort's eyes. I don't think he spoke to me for a week. So I'd say I touched a third rail, but that would be a cliche, Mort. We can't say that. We can't say that. I'll leave you with just a quick story about a special edition we did at Women's Wear, a celebration of the paper's 90th anniversary in 2001. So you think a newspaper would celebrate its 100th, right? Who celebrates their 90th anniversary? The truth is, it was a tough year, and the publisher and CEO weren't going to make their bonuses that year. Can you imagine? And this idea was a surefire moneymaker, and our CEO at the time could be particularly persuasive. Turns out we produced a history book on deadline, having bullied Mort to come back from retirement and shepherd the enormously ambitious project. We saw how the industry paralleled society through the 20th century. We'd had a fashion reporter on the Titanic who supplied one of the first-hand accounts of the sinking. And our reporter in Berlin wrote about Nazi intimidation of Jewish merchants in 1933. We ran sketches of by Benito Mussolini about what a good Italian citizen should wear. No surprise here was togas. It all continued right up to the explosion of glamorous designers, IPOs, clubby billionaires, and digital revolution. As part of the anniversary issue, we asked our most esteemed alumni to write first-hand accounts of life at Women's Wear. For our fearless chairman, the headline was, "The Naughty Mr. Fairchild." For James Brady, Mr. Fairchild's partner in crime in the 60s and 70s, the headline was, "Scoops, Scandals, and Scalawags." But no surprise, Mort's story had the best headline. As he described life in an old-fashioned newsroom, 10 numerals, 26 letters, and a miracle every day. 40 years. That's a lot of miracles, Mort. Now, if you could just change the water at our table into wine, maybe a nice red Bordeaux, we'll all be really impressed. I salute you, my friend.
Thank you, Ed. And now we'd like to have Mort tell some more stories as he gets interviewed by Clyde Haberman.
I'm delighted to have been asked to do this, and I was glad to hear the talk about cliches. I always felt you should avoid cliches like the plague, and I fully agree. A couple of people got it. Mort, let me begin with one of your earliest journalist experiences. You were a copy boy at the Daily News back in its heyday. It's certainly a much diminished influence now. What was that newsroom like back then?
Say again?
What was that newsroom like back then?
The newsroom at the Daily News was just what you might have expected. Noisy, because you could hear typewriters going all the time, and almost everybody was touch typing. I'm sorry, finger typing, not touch typing. Teletype machines from the AP and UPI, or maybe it was UP, just UP in those days, and telephones jangling, and people, a lot of smoke in the air, a lot of cigarette smoke, and cigarette butts all over the place. And it was an old edition of a newsroom. It was people talking loud, people shouting across the room at one another, and the one word that seems to describe it all for me is the word energy. There was so much energy in that newsroom. And I know people today, and I've seen it for myself on visits back to Women's Wear Daily, people today describe newsrooms as having the ambiance of an insurance company. And you don't hear everything is very quiet, very quiet. So that's basically what the newsroom was like.
And was the Women's Wear Daily newsroom like that? I guess those of us who don't know Women's Wear Daily that well have a sort of an image of a more sedate operation.
Hardly.
Okay.
Today, I imagine that would be true. But I joined the paper in 1960, and one of the things, there were two things about it that attracted me. One was there was a wall between editorial and advertising, and that was very unusual for a trade publication. I worked on a trade publication just before I came to Women's Wear Daily, And it was a magazine that covered parts of the garment industry. It had the wonderful and most attractive title, Hosiery and Underwear Review. and it was the kind of a place where the publisher would tell the reporter, me in that case, why don't you go and see so-and-so? He's an old friend. Old friend was the euphemism for he was a major advertiser, or maybe not even major. And he would send the ad salesman along with me. That was fairly typical of trade publications in those days. I had a friend who was working at Women's Wear Daily at the time, and I'd have lunch with him regularly. And he said it's not like that at Women's Wear. He said Louis Fairchild, this was John Fairchild's father, and Louis was the second generation of Fairchilds to own the paper. He said Louis backs up his reporters, and it was true. You could do a piece that the people at DuPont might not like. DuPont was by far the biggest advertiser in women's wear at that time. And if DuPont complained about it, and they complained to Louis, Louis would say, was there anything in the story that was not accurate? And if they couldn't answer that question, that was the end of the discussion. And I found that to be, in very large measure, true when I got there. And that's what kept me there, among other things. But yes, that's very much what the newsroom of women's wear was like at the time.
And John Fairchild, was he fair or a child? The New York Times' obit on him a few years ago wasn't especially kind and suggested, well, what's the right word for it? Anyway, but, people would be banished from the publication. Designers would find themselves in exile. How much did that seep down to the newsroom? I assume it did, and of course you were in charge of the newsroom. So to what degree did you have to balance him and the news?
Well, John would have his feuds with certain designers. There was no question about that. And the origin of those feuds was sometimes very murky. It was hard to get people to admit to anything or to acknowledge anything. But some of his feuds were directly on the side of good journalism. We sent someone to interview, I think, one of the major designers, Jeffrey Bean, and Jeffrey Bean was not pleased with who we sent. He thought that this person wasn't high enough on the totem pole of fashion and fashion reporting to be assigned to him, and he bitched about it. And that was the last the paper mentioned of Jeffrey Bean for quite some time. And in a way, I was, I was okay with that. Although, of course, you don't like to see anybody arbitrarily banished from the news columns if they were making news. We were there to report news, not to cater to anybody's personal whims. So, yeah, there were feuds, and could he be fair? I guess it depends on where you were standing at the time.
Did designers and others in the industry, were they practically folding over one another to designers and others in what in my family we inelegantly known as the schmata trade? Were they practically folding over each other to get articles in Women's Wear Daily? To what degree did that factor in? And sort of related, how influential was Women's Wear Daily in the fields of politics and civics, be it nationwide or in New York. I mean, were you a force in that regard?
Well, from its origin in 1910, that's when the first issue of Women's Wear Daily was published. It started as a quarterly, and it became a daily with issue number 2. That's the truth. It was always the feeling of the Fairchild family not to run editorials about politics or civic affairs or anything like that. We never backed a candidate. Most candidates for political office through the years were men. We covered the women's fashion industry, and we were quite often more interested in the candidates' wives than we were in the candidates themselves. As for people wanting desperately to get their stuff into the paper, one night I was covering, along with a colleague, we were covering an industry meeting up in the Garment Center. And at about 5 o'clock in the evening, we got a phone call from our editor telling us that a huge fire had broken out in 1400 Broadway. An outdoor air conditioning unit, which was really quite large, had short-circuited, and flames were going into the sky. It was really spectacular. Fortunately, most of the damage was on the outside, and it was to that air conditioner. My colleague, a guy named Bernie Groger, Bernie and I left the meeting we were covering and hightailed it over to 1400 Broadway, which was close by. And about an hour later, the fire department, which had evacuated the building, were allowing people back in. So Bernie and I went in to survey the damage and to prepare for a story that would be in the paper the following morning. And we found one showroom that was open, and 2 guys were in there, and they were working on inventory, and they see me and Bernie walk in, and they said, "Are you guys from the insurance company?" And we said, "No, we're from Women's Wear Daily." He said, "Women's Wear?" He turned to his partner, he said, "We've been trying to get you guys to look at our line for years." He said, "Harry, show them the new dresses." That was sort of typical of what would happen.
Did Harry show you the dresses? Did Harry show you the dresses?
We told him, "Don't bother. That's not what we're here for." The poor guy was crushed.
Poor guy. You did a lot of writing, not just editing, Morton. And Mike Candel's piece in the Silurian News described 2 of your favorites being Zira Mostel and Alistair Cook. Hard to imagine 2 people more different than the 2 of them. And frankly, also, every time I hear the name or even say the name Alistair Cook, I'm always reminded of the Sesame Street Cookie Monster as Alistair Cookie on Monster Piece Theater. But separate matter. But anyway, can you describe some of your favorite things, to use a Sound of Music song title?
Well, 2 men could not be further alike than Mostel and Alistair Cook. Alistair Cook had a new book out on America, and hence was available for interviews. He was doing a little promotional. And we made a date to go and talk to him. And of course, I had always admired him from Omnibus, among other things. And he was living in a building on 5th Avenue. And we were admitted to the building. I was with a photographer. And we knocked on his door. He had been alerted we were on the way up. And he opened the door and smiled at us. And in the background, you could hear a piano. And the first words out of his mouth were, That's George Gershwin himself at the piano. And I thought I had just turned on a giant television set with really high definition. He was introducing somebody. It turned out that Cook liked to play piano, and he had gotten what was then a very hard to get tape. He had to go to the BBC for help of a recording of George Gershwin playing an old show tune, Walking the Dog, I think was the name of it. But the way Cook introduced that, and it was like turning on your television. That's Gershwin himself at the piano. And then he ushered us in, and he allowed us to stay for the 3 hours. This was early in 1976, and the bicentennial was just around the corner in July. And this was probably in January or February. And he talked a lot about his impressions of America and his travels across America when he came here from England. And he had the most startling turn of phrase sometimes. He said, when I saw the way blacks were being treated in America, it was like seeing a thumb come through the Constitution. I'd never heard anybody express it quite like that. And toward the end of the interview, I mean, I'd been there for 3 hours, and I thought, how long is this man going to put up with me? I said to him, I just want to ask you one more question. And it's kind of a grand question. And his eyes began to roll. And I said, as we approach the bicentennial, and he started repeating the words without saying them out loud, but his lips were moving, as we approach the bicentennial. I said, how would you assess the strengths and weaknesses of this country? And he completed this eye roll. And he said, well, that is a rather grand question. And he took just a small breath, and then he answered in a paragraph. It had everything, including punctuation. And a quote from H.L. Mencken, that Mencken had told him when he first came to live in America. It was quite astonishing, and I'd only experienced that kind of impromptu response to a question, and the answer was so skillfully composed, and that was from Gay Talese. When I was doing the London Times had published an article about New York City, that was written by its New York correspondent, and it dumped on the city. This was during the Lindsay administration. It just dumped all over the city and made it sound like the most horrible place in the world. And I thought to myself, there are people who choose to live here. And I want to ask them, I want to do a story about them and why they choose to live here. And there were certain qualifications. They had to live in one of the 5 boroughs. They had to do work that did not compel them to live in New York City. They could live anywhere they wanted and do what they do. And they had to have some degree of perspective. They had to have been around at least a bit so that New York was not the only place they knew about. And one of the people I called was Gay Talese, who was then no longer with the New York Times, and he was writing books. And I asked him that question. I said, why do you choose to live in New York City? And he said, do you want me to answer that now, or can I think about it? This was over the telephone. I said, no, I'd like an answer now. And he went into this wonderful little comparison of New York and Los Angeles. And I don't remember it word for word, but he said things like, New York is a vertical city. Los Angeles is horizontal. The big sport here, and it was at the time, is basketball. It's when the Knicks were at their height, so to speak. And he said the big sport in Los Angeles is football. He says in New York, everybody is always fighting for space, whether it's space to walk in the street or space to park your car. In Los Angeles, everyone is in their car, and they're on the highways, and the windows are shut tight so that the air conditioning will work properly. He says, and nobody touches anybody. And there's no energy like the energy of New York City, and that's why I live here. I'm paraphrasing badly, but that was the gist of this impromptu remark. So I always admired Talese for his ability to do that.
May I assume that Zero Mostel was
Mostel.
not as elegant as Alistair Cook? Or am I wrong?
He was elegant in his way. I was able to get an interview with him. He was doing nothing at the time in terms of acting. He was painting, though. Mostel was a serious painter. He always described himself as a painter who acts for a living. And I was a good friend of a man who shared studio space with him, who was also a painter. And I said to him one day, Alex, why don't you talk to Mostel and maybe he'll agree to see me? And Alex said, well, why do you want to interview Mostel? He'll pull on your mustache, he'll muss your hair, or he'll stick your head out the window. I said, well, maybe that's why. And a few weeks later, I got a phone call, and it was Alex, and he said, got somebody here who wants to talk to you. And the next thing I heard was, I hear you're a Vance. A Vance, Vance, for those of you who may not know, is a Yiddish word that means bedbug. And it's often used as a term of endearment, particularly by grandparents to their grandchildren. Oh, the little Vansela. I hear you're a Vance. And we had a conversation, and we made a date, and I went to see him in his studio. And again, several hours. And the conversation just ranged from his days on the blacklist to his unhappiness with the director of the movie version of Fiddler, to the fact that critics don't like it when he changes his performance on Broadway from show to show. But that was part of Zero's magic. And occasionally he would say things that were totally startling. I told him I had heard a story about him from a friend of his named A. Alvarez. The A was for Al. Al Alvarez was a Sephardic Jew who lived in Britain. And I had interviewed him several months earlier when he wrote a book called The Savage God, which was a study of suicide by artists. And Alvarez himself was a failed suicide. He had swallowed 42 sleeping pills one day and then literally woke up. So one of the questions I asked him was, did he ever feel he would try that again? And he said, I think I killed the part of me that wanted to die. Anyway, Alvarez, when we were leaving Alvarez, I said, how can I reach you for follow-up questions? And he said, well, I'm staying with Zero Mostel. I said, really? And how did that happen? When did you become friends? And he said that Mostel was acting in London in Ulysses in Nighttown, and Alvarez, who wrote criticism, theater criticism, was assigned to review the play, and that's how they met, and they became buddies. And then Alvarez told me a story about Mostel. He said, you know, he was at one time working in the Catskills doing stand-up at one of the Borscht Belt hotels. And when he was driving up there, he stopped in a place that a lot of people would stop at for a sandwich or to use the restroom. He says, and that's what Zero needed. And he walked into the restroom, and this is Alvarez speaking now. He said he saw a man peeing dreamily into the urinal. And Mostel looked at him, and he said, "Mister, you pee like Chagall." And the guy turned to him and said, "I am Chagall." So I asked Mostel if that was true. The first thing he said was, "Oh, Alvarez, isn't it a pity that he did not succeed in his suicide attempt?" I said, "Why do you say a thing like that?" He said, "Because then we could speak of him with respect." Anyway, I said, "So was that story true?" He said, "Except for one thing, the conversation was in Yiddish." I said, "Mister, du pischt wie Chagall," and he said, "Ich bin Chagall," and it was.
Okay.
That was Mostel.
I can't think of anything to say after that. Wow. Peeing with Chagall. Floating in the air. Anyway, could Women's Wear Daily make or break a designer?
Not really.
Make or break a store, or no?
We couldn't make
Yeah.
or break a designer because in the final analysis in the fashion industry, it's up to the buyers, the retailers, to say whether somebody's clothing was suitable for their stores and whether they could sell it to the consumer. The best we could do, we could introduce a designer who perhaps few people were familiar with, few people in the retail industry. And we could give them some space in the paper and say, this is a very talented new designer. Then it was up to the buyers. And we could ignore a designer, as happened from time to time. But usually, these were designers who were already well established. We did not kill Jeffrey Bean's business by ignoring him for a long time, or Pauline Trigère. I'm very happy to see here today some of my former colleagues at Women's Wear Daily, in addition to Ed Nardoza, who was my editor for a long time, and they'll back me up on this, that there was no way we could make or break a designer, nor were we. It was a fairly common slogan. People said, "Oh, Women's Wear Daily, that's the Bible of the fashion industry." We are not anybody's Bible. We tried to give an accurate description of what was going on as best we could, but we were not a Bible.
Whenever anybody says something's the Bible, they never say whether it's the Old or the New Testament. But any major bloopers looking back that either you had edited or written and wished you could take back? I mean, we've all had.
You mean by me, personally?
Well,
Probably.
yeah, I'm interviewing you. Yeah, no, I mean, big picture missed. I don't know. I don't mean a small error. We've all committed them, I'm sure. But any things you feel you would redo if you were given a chance?
Probably. I don't know that there's a newspaper anywhere that wouldn't have that, be glad to have that opportunity. We're always editing, and that's basically what it comes down to. Sometimes you just got to let go because the clock says so. But I've made mistakes in stories, mistakes of fact because of carelessness. The paper has we were accused of making mistakes throughout. when a new skirt length presented itself, called the MIDI, M-I-D-I, and the paper was really quick to jump on that. It upset a lot of people in the industry because they had to suddenly change their ways of doing things, change their plans, change their patterns. And we were accused of overplaying something. We've been accused of underplaying something. But that comes with the territory.
Absolutely.
You try to do the best you can.
Absolutely. Let me turn to you folks. Any questions? Got one here, Alan.
Mort, what was the greatest expense account you either submitted or approved?
The greatest expense.
Expense account you either submitted or approved as managing editor.
Well, I didn't approve expense accounts. Thank God that wasn't up to me. And there was nothing that could compare to the very well-known Johnny Apple of the New York Times, who once submitted an expense account for having breakfast someplace of several $100s. And when he was asked about it, he said, well, we had caviar. And his editors said, what are you, nuts? And he said, what's the problem? Eggs is eggs. So, my expense accounts were, what subway fare to the Garment Center.
The most important tip I ever got about doing expense accounts in newspapers was my former colleague Alan Riding, who was in Paris, who always said to me, never do your expense account when you're in a good mood. And he was absolutely right, because you would always err on the publisher's favor in that regard. Always be ticked off when you filled it out. There was David.
Should I stand up? Two quick questions. One is, did you ever have any interesting encounters with the heads of?
Sorry?
Did you ever have any interesting encounters with the heads of the garment workers unions? That's the first. And the second is the experience of walking through the garment district. If you were to walk through it now, how would it contrast to the garment district in its heyday?
I'll answer that question first. It's two different worlds. The Garment Center, when I started with women's wear in 1960, if you went through the Garment Center during lunchtime, let's say, it would take you a long time to get through because there's so many people in the streets. It was at the time, the biggest single employer in New York City. And it would literally spill its guts out into the streets at lunchtime. Everybody was out there. Some of my best sources were people I never saw any place but on that sidewalk. But there was one guy in particular who seemed to know everything that was going on. And I would make it a practice to see him daily if I could, and just say, Willie, what's happening? And he would say, oh, well, you should check the such and such company. They just named a new sales manager. And check this company because I hear this guy is on his way out. And he had nothing to gain by this. And he was unknown to anybody except me. He was right on the nose so many times. There was a documentary on HBO a couple of years ago called Schmatta. And the subtitle was From Rags to Riches to Rags. And it was the story of how the Garment Center had risen, become what it became, and then fell back again to become what it is today, which is basically a shadow of what it was. Now, I'm retired since the year 2000. I'm retired almost 24 years. I'm not really certain of what it's like today, but I know what you mean about walking through it. It's quiet now. In the old days, it was feisty. There was a story about a man walking through the garment center at lunchtime in the old days, and let's see if I can remember this. It was a woman. She was a seamstress at one of the garment companies, a member of the ILGWU, and suddenly a man jumped out of a doorway wearing a raincoat, and he did this. He flashed her in the middle of the street. And she looked at him and she said, you call that a lining? And that to me typified what the old garment center was. It was feisty. You never could tell what you were going to hear. And it was alive. It was alive and growing.
I think David's first question was whether you had any memorable or interesting encounters with the heads of the ILGWU.
Yeah, well, I had met David Dubinsky a couple of times when he was the president, and he was a great larger-than-life character. I wrote something once that indicated he'd been around a long time, and he called me. He had never called me about anything, and he called me, and he was really upset, and he said, "What are you putting in the paper? That I should retire? You want me to retire already?" And I had to apologize to him. I said, "That's not what I meant." But I covered labor management negotiations when contracts needed to be renewed. And in the 60s, when I was doing that, covering 7th Avenue, there was a possibility that there would actually be a strike. And that hadn't happened for a long time, not in my experience at any rate. And of course, the union was upset if I wrote anything about favorable toward management and vice versa, which made me think if I was offending both parties, I was doing a reasonably good job, I thought. It was a very funny incident that happened during those negotiations. Dubinsky was a good friend of a garment manufacturer by the name of Abe Schrader. They were young men together, growing up in the garment industry, and one was labor and one was management. And Abe Schrader was, to me, a quintessential garment guy. He was self-made. One day I said to him, "Abe, are you a rich man?" And he cocked an eyebrow up. And I said, "Are you a millionaire?" He said, "A poor one." 2, 3. And Schrader was featured in a story I wrote one day. He was saying, we have to get a break in these contract negotiations. It's a matter of survival. And I think that might have even been the headline. And that week I had to cover a meeting between labor and management at one of the hotels, the one up in Times Square in the high 50s. And I was approaching the hotel where this meeting would take place, and two things happened. A limousine pulled up, and the chauffeur popped out, opened the back door, and out popped Abe Schrader. This was about 9 a.m., and Schrader was gorgeous. He was a beautiful suit, and he had freshly shaven, and you could practically see the remnants of the talcum powder rising off him. And his shoes were as shiny as could be. And along the street came a man named Emil Schlesinger, who was an attorney for the ILGWU. And they were both on their way to these contract talks. And Schlesinger was schlumpy. He had papers sticking out of his jacket pocket. He had that morning's New York Times leaving imprints on his jacket, which was under a sweaty armpit. And he and Schrader bumped into each other. And Schlesinger said, "Good morning, Gabe. I see you're here to fight for survival."
So, Mort, I'm here.
Where are we?
Over here, Mort.
Over
Okay.
here. So, your story about Zero Mostel really resonated for me. And you said you spent several hours with Zero Mostel.
I'm sorry?
You said you spent several hours with Zero
Yes.
Mostel. So I'm wondering specifically if you got the chance to see Ulysses in Nighttown, which I was honored and privileged to have seen Zero Mostel in that performance.
Did I
It was
see him?
spectacular. And I'm curious, you spent several hours with him. Did you have a chance to see him in other things besides Fiddler or something?
I saw him in Forum. Funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. And he was doing shtick throughout. Of course, he kept in character, except when some latecomer came in and had a seat pretty close to the front of the orchestra. And Mostel looked at him and struck up a conversation with him. And he asked him, he said, "How come you're late?" And this guy said something about, "I couldn't find my socks." And he said it loud enough for it to be heard by the entire Roy. It brought the house down. But Mostel would do things like that all the time.
I think we have time for just one or two more. Do we? Not by me.
Up
No.
to Joe, I guess.
Yes, sir. Two more.
Mort, there's a story over here, Mort.
Here we are.
There's a story you tell that I think shows you in action as an editor and is also very funny. The time you sent a reporter to interview Alfred Hitchcock.
Oh yeah, Hitchcock was in town. Thank you, Lou, for remembering that. And he was doing promotion for one of his last movies, Frenzy, I think. And we sent a reporter to interview him at his hotel. And the guy came back, and he wrote a very good lead to his story. And his lead was something like, he described himself coming into the hotel room, my reporter, his name was Richard, and he was holding a little shopping bag. And Hitchcock said, "What's in the bag?" And he said, "Oh, I just bought a shirt." And Hitchcock said, "No, a dead baby." And then the rest of his piece was a really boring promotional piece about the movie. And I called him over, I said, "Richard, a great lead, and then the story reads like a press release." I said, "You were with Hitchcock for I don't know how long. How long were you there?" He said, "About an hour and a half." I said, "What else happened in that room? You were alone with Hitchcock." He said, "Well, actually, we weren't alone." I said, "Oh? Who else was there?" He said, "Hitchcock's wife." I said, "Really? And did you see her?" He said, "Yes." I said, "And did she have anything to say? What was she like?" He said she was very quiet, but at one point she said, "I'm going to get some drinks. Would anybody like the water or anything, beer?" And she left the room, and Hitchcock turned and said, "She's going to poison your drink." I said, "Would you please go back to your typewriter and write that and tell us more about what happened in the room?" And he did, and so that was
that was a fortunate, sometimes you grill when you're an editor and you ask a reporter for more information about something, you come up with an astonishing story, and he did. He wrote a really good piece. But, you had to sometimes, people don't always see the same thing, or people don't expect you to want the same thing. I remember once we hired a woman in Boston as a reporter. Her name was Madeline Blaze, and she later won a Pulitzer Prize, not for us, after she left us.
Miami Herald. Miami Herald.
It was the Miami Herald, that's correct, that's right. And anyway, Madeline started off writing for us, and I thought, wow, she's really got the touch. And then they assigned her at Women's Wear to write items for our I column, EYE, which was a potpourri of stuff. And her writing style just changed totally, and it became forced, like she was trying to force a humorous anecdote out. And I called her, I said, what's going on? I said, your writing style just went from Madeline to something else. Did you think we wanted a certain type of writing for the I page? And she said, yes. I said, forget that. Write what you want to write, and write it the way you write, because you're a terrific writer. That's what happened. And that was the last we saw of the, trying to force something out.
One more over here, I guess.
Sal?
Mort, some of us here know that your journalism career started at City College as a student reporter and editor. And I think you were there, and you may have actually started in sports, right? Was sports your interest at that time? And wasn't there a big event that occurred during your period there?
A big
The scandal.
Yeah, I was
The scandal.
When I entered City College in 1950, the college basketball team won the two major tournaments at the end of the year. That the same team had never won both tournaments before.
Or since. Or since.
Since, yes, or since. And the team became very much in the spotlight. Nat Holman, who had been the basketball coach forever, was the coach. And the following year, many members of the team were arrested in a bribery scandal. I won't go into the details of the scandal, but it became a real low point in the history of athletics at City College. And I was on the sports staff of one of the City College student publications. It was called The Campus. There are people in this room who were on the campus when they were at City College. And there are people who are on our rival publication, Jerry Eskenazi, called Observation Post, or OP. And when I was a freshman, just into the school, one of the first things I did was go to the office of the campus and apply to be on the staff. And I said, and I'd really like to be on the sports staff. The sports editor at that time was someone who was a previous Lifetime Achievement Award winner from the Silurians, Marvin Kalb. Marvin's older brother, Bernie, also, they shared a Lifetime Award a couple of years ago. Marvin was the editor, and he was covering the basketball team during those days of the scandal, and he was in graduate school when the roof fell in the following year. But yes, did you have any questions about that,
Well,
Sal?
Well, I wondered if you covered any of
the indictments or the trials that went on?
I'm sorry?
If you covered any of the legal issues that
you cover-
evolved out of that scandal?
Did
The
you,
legal
did you
interest-
cover any of the trials and did you cover any of the trials and other fallout from
I
the
did
scandal?
not. No, I was too green on the paper at that time.
I think we have to. I think I've had the easiest job any moderator has ever had here. So, thank you. But I think we have to go. It was just wonderful. Thank you, Mort.
Mort, the stories you told as an editor, the stories you told of yourself as an editor completely justifies our choice of you as a Lifetime Achievement Award. They're wonderful stories. And that's the way we'd like all editors to be.
Before I step down, I would just like to acknowledge the presence here of some people in my family. One of my nephews, Neil Salzman, is here, and his daughters, my great nieces, Abby and Honey, and Neil's sweetheart, Brigitte. And thank you very much for coming. You make me proud. Also here with some of my old friends, Art Stevens, Lewis Nelson, and Ed, thank you again for this introduction. And I want to say one more thing about my interlocutor.
And thank you, Clyde, yes.
In 2003, I was inducted into the City College Communications Hall of Fame, and one of my fellow inductees was Clyde Haberman.